Okay, here we go. Week 8, it's midterm week, and we're going to stop off in medieval Europe. Well, we're not going to cover all of medieval Europe. We're going to cover early-ish medieval Europe, and we're going to stop around the 13th century, maybe 12th century. Before we go on, I do want to tell you again, please be mindful when you're taking this midterm that you use only your textbook, your source book, and your lectures. Do not use any other source from outside of that. The plagiarism detection software will kind of red flag it. I will go double check it to make sure that it's up to snuff. And if it's not, well, things will go horribly, horribly wrong. Please don't make me do that. All right, so enough of the warning out of the way. Let's go ahead and get moving. Terms, of course. This is a good way to start. Feudal is a complex word. If you decide to delve into medieval European history, this word will drive you bananas, all right? Because feudalism means one thing in one country and something else in a different country. But in general, feudal is considered a system in which there's a balance of obligations and protections which are used to ensure that a country remains stable. So what do I mean? Well, essentially, those who are really low down the ladder, social ladder, have a lot of obligations. For instance, serfs or peasants. They provide a lot of taxes, and they provide a lot of labor, and often they provide foot soldiers in armies. Well, they have a lot of obligations. There are some protections in place, for instance, feast days or days off or marriages and things like that are often somehow paid for, or at least defrayed, the cost of them are defrayed by those higher up, say lords or kings. Now, that's not to say that the lord gets all of the benefits and has almost no obligations. The lords actually have a lot of obligations, often to each other. And being a king in the medieval period is, at times, a very sketchy proposition. Your rule is almost never absolute. The Franks are a really good example of this feudal system being kind of balance between obligations and protections, and then your position being not absolute. The Franks are one of many Germanic tribes which fill the vacuum left by the retreating and collapsing Western Roman Empire. Now, the Roman Empire does not collapse overnight. It doesn't fall into anarchy and the ravening, frothing at the mouth barbarian hordes come flooding in, raping, pillaging, looting, burning. Some barbarians do that, but then again, so do some rogue legions, Roman legions. And even after the last emperor is forced to abdicate, Romulus Augustus is essentially retired to a little villa in Tuscany, where he will live out the rest of his days, which is not bad. I mean, he's, I think, 16 at the time when he is forcibly retired by his general. A small rump state exists, but that very quickly falls apart in the face of these Germanic tribes moving in. Well, one of the successful ones is the Franks, and eventually they will settle in what is now modern-day France, a part of Italy, and a part of modern-day Switzerland. They expand, of course, into what is now the modern-day country of France. But they also form the basis of the Holy Roman Empire. Viking, one of those non-Germanic people, but very Germanic influenced, or very Germanic-like, Germanic-esque, I guess, that is taking advantage of some of the shifts in demographics as well as improvements in technology. Starting around the 8th century, we have the beginning of what's called the Viking Age, an age when the Scandinavian people from Sweden, Norway, Finland, and even Denmark begin exploring and essentially projecting their power overseas. Now, the Scandinavian Vikings, sometimes referred to as Northmen, they are not just in it for the raids and the pillages and the plunder. Some of them are there to find new lands to farm. Some of them are looking for new horizons and new things to exploit. They're looking for new trading partners. So it's a very complex set of motivations that caused the Vikings to really kind of explode out of Scandinavia around the 8th century and into the 9th and 10th century. Now, serf, I alluded to earlier in the feudal system, a serf is not a slave. Yes, the Romans had slaves, absolutely. Interestingly enough, so did the Vikings and some of these other Germanic tribes. They absolutely had slaves. But by and large, if we go into the medieval period, slavery is relatively uncommon. Instead, you have what's called a serf. A serf is a peasant who really isn't free to move about. We often think of ourselves as individuals, and the primacy of the individual, especially in the United States, is taken as a given, as the natural state of being. Well, that's not true throughout most of history. Being a peasant, being of low birth, meant that a lot of people got to tell you what to do, and you really didn't have any recourse to it. And a perfect example is a serf. Serfs are tied to the land. They're treated often in the same vein as other assets on the land, say a particularly nice stand of trees, or a very healthy healthy herd of deer, or a really nice brook, and no more could the trees get up and move than a serf could get up and move. So these serfs, if they were working under an oppressive lord, they had certain recourses, and of course this didn't mean that they absolutely had to take everything laying down. There were several peasant rebellions and serf rebellions throughout the medieval period, but serfs, by and large, they are exploited. They are taken advantage of, and they provide the labor, they provide the food, they provide most of the service. So being a serf in the medieval period, not exactly a sweet gig, and the majority of people in Europe at the time, between the 6th century of the current era all the way up into the Renaissance, are indeed peasants and serfs. As I mentioned before, the Roman Empire is collapsing. It is coming apart at the seams. By the time we get to about the 5th century, so the mid 400s, the Roman Empire is in full-blown retreat. For instance, in Roman Britain, the Romanized Celts and other post-Roman Britons are facing hordes of Picts and Jutes and Saxons and Angles, and they call to Rome for help, and Rome says, you're on your own. So it's really a difficult position to be in if you're one of the far-flung provinces, and then increasingly if you are one of the core provinces, such as poor Rome, which gets sacked several times in this period. And this is just an idea of how many different groups of people are moving and relocating. Now, one of the things that I want you to really focus on is that green line that says Huns. The Huns are actually a Eastern Europe, Central Asian kind of people, and they displace people further west. As they move further and further west, they're displacing these Germanic tribes. These Germanic tribes begin to move southward and westward, occupying a lot of the places that the Romans are essentially abdicating their power over. It doesn't mean that people are gone. Absolutely not. There are still people living in, say, Gaul or Iberia or places like that, but there is no infrastructure. There is no Roman command. So a lot of these Germanic invaders are not so much invaders as they are trying to occupy lands in what is a very quickly fading empire, trying to become citizens, such as the Goths. Alaric the Goth tries to lead his people into Rome to become citizens and finds himself exploited. So by the time we get to the end of 500 current era, the western portion of the Roman kingdom, which you'll have read during the Roman chapter, the Romans had been divided into Eastern and Western Empire. The western portion of the empire, I said kingdom earlier, didn't I? Well, the western portion of the empire has, for all intents and purposes, ceased to exist. But that doesn't mean that Rome is gone. Now, there's a question as to whether Rome collapses like a house of cards or begins to slide and decay and fall apart. The Roman Empire is really large and already divided politically and culturally. Emperor Constantine had temporarily reunited both Eastern and Western empires and established Christianity as an official religion. Well, if not necessarily an official religion, at least a tolerant and accepted religion. It would be later emperors who really establish it as the official religion. Emperor Constantine also establishes Christian orthodoxy. The Nicene Creed, for example, is his handiwork. It was an attempt to root out all the different interpretations of Christianity that were floating around the Mediterranean and to come out with a single unified concept of what it means to be a Christian. Is Jesus holy? Is he a prophet? Is he actually the Son of Man? Is he divine? Is he mortal? Is he both? Is he neither? So a lot of these questions need to be answered, and they are in the Council of Nicaea. The Germanic tribes initially come into the territories of Western Rome as immigrants. They're looking to become citizens in many cases. Now, not all of them, of course. Some of them are looking for plunder or revenge or status or whatever, but a good example would be the Goths, led by Alaric I. They initially come to Roman territory to become citizens of Rome. They had been displaced by the Huns and others. They're looking for help. Well, Alaric and his Goths are recruited into the legions. They fight for the legions, and they are promised that they would receive land and recognition. Instead, a lot of their people are left on the borders to act as a buffer between the less friendly Germanic tribes and the home territories of the Romans. And so Alaric and his men go on this holy pilgrimage, well, they call it a holy pilgrimage, to Rome. And they then demand, when they are in Rome, that the land be granted to them. Although the Senate says yes, the emperor says no, and so Alaric and his men sack Rome around 400 of the current era. The later Germanic invaders do mimic Roman society and military. They rebuild roads, they adopt Romanesque titles, they even utilize military formations that the Romans had used to their success. A really good example is the Ostrogothic tribes try to recreate the Roman Empire with a slight German interpretation in Italy, in the Italian peninsula. But their attempts at recreating Rome as a German state are undone by the attacks by the Byzantines, or the Eastern Roman Empire, who saw them as usurpers and taking possession of Rome. Of course, how can you be the Roman Empire and not own Rome, right? So here's some food for thought. The Visigoths and Goths in Italy and Spain emulate the Roman systems. They're thoroughly Romanized and Christianized by this point. They reestablished Romanesque order and policies by around the 6th century of the current era. These are the two big powerhouses in the early years after the collapse. The Eastern Roman Empire is still strong. It doesn't disappear like the Western Latin Roman rump state does. They see the Germanic occupation of Rome in a completely different light, whereas the Goths and Visigoths saw themselves as inheriting Rome. In fact, there's apocryphal anecdotal stories of people running away from these barbarian hordes only to be chased down and to be told, "We would like to buy your villa." I don't know how true this is. I don't have any sources for it, but it gives you an idea of the difference in perception that some Romans, quote-unquote Romans, whether they be Byzantines or those living in the Latin portion, saw this as a disastrous turn of events, but the people coming in may have seen themselves as just participating in a system that they thought was still working. The weakened Goth and Visigoth states later on leave the door open to a more successful German tribe, or a set of German tribes that are less successful in recreating Roman ideas, Roman language, Roman administration, to one degree or another. A good example of this would be the Franks that I mentioned before, and the Angles and the Saxons, and of course the Utes. So Germanic emulation of the Roman way of empire was actually very genuine. It was Rome was the yardstick by which other European societies measured themselves. And the Franks, who come from further in Germania, actually a little bit to the east of where they eventually settle. They are composed of a bunch of clans, and these Franks are led by two very strong clans, two very strong families. The first is the Merovingians, who are absolutely in power when the Franks move into this territory around 480, and the Carolingians, who are essentially the second fiddle for the longest time. They set up fortified villas. In fact, they even call them villas. They don't call them castles. They don't call them fortresses. They call them villas. And they begin to emulate the Roman administration of Gaul, what they would later call Francia. They sponsor and support the church, much the way that the Romans had. They build monasteries. They establish bishoprics. They divide their territory into dioceses. And they also, more importantly, wage war against pagans and infidels. And what do I mean by infidels? Well, there are, as I mentioned, a lot of interpretations of Christianity out there. Some are not considered orthodox. They're considered infidels. They're considered heretics. So we need to get rid of these. Now, early medieval leadership, especially for kings, was based upon your prowess in battle. If you were successful in battle, it was more likely that people were going to flock to your banner the next time you went to war. If you were less successful, it was highly unlikely that they were going to help you try to recapture your lost glory. And often the loyalty to these kings, for lack of a better term, is because these kings had such a good reputation, and they used their battle prowess or their reputation for fighting to ensure loyalty. And loyalty was enforced through force of arms. If you betrayed your king, or if you didn't show up with the levy that you said, you were probably on the chopping block next time around. The strongest of the Franks in the 6th century is this family called the Merovingians. Merovac, the original mythological founder of this family, the origins of this family go even way into pre-Christian periods. Merovac was alleged to have been the offspring of a sea monster. So there you go. He's got this kind of demigod reputation, and his family is very powerful coming into the 6th century. They begin to conquer territories in order to prove that they have the right to rule. So essentially, success breeds success. The more territory you're able to take away from somebody else, these other smaller tribes, these other smaller clans, the more you're able to take away from these other people, the more successful you are. The more successful you are, the more right you have to govern. As a reward, because people don't do something for nothing often. It definitely not fight wars. Often the leaders of these support clans or the distant family members who helped wage wars and conquer this territory were given small parcels of land and thus given noble titles. And they were able to govern the land in the king's name. At least that was the idea. That when the time came, the king could absolutely rely upon you. He didn't have to go stumping or campaigning to try to get people to join his army. Works out a little bit less ideally than perhaps the kings would have liked, but there you have it. Now, the kings who let others lead in battle run the risk of letting the other people, say their son or their cousin or maybe their second fiddle major domo, allow the possibility that those people might accrue more fame, more loyalty, and more prestige than the king himself. It also leads to some interesting questions. Eventually, you're going to run out of lands to conquer. The Romans did. Heavens knows that the Romans tried to press into Germania, but then found that they really couldn't. The Romans tried to press further into Iraq, for example, but they found they couldn't. There's an extent to how much you can conquer. So what happens when there is no more land to conquer? What happens when there are no more enemies to be had? Well, it's an interesting question for the Merovingians. The Merovingians set up what becomes a kind of model relationship with the church. The church is the last vestige, and actually pretty close vestige, to Roman rule. And so being close to the church affords you a level of legitimacy that others may lack, and also gives you that sense of continuity with the Roman past. On one hand, the kings are, for lack of a better term, the stick of early medieval European politics. They militarily defeat foes, they prevent invasion, they are the muscle that puts down heresy and treason, at least at first. They eliminate opposition, and they collect taxes and rents on the lands, making the lands profitable. The church, on the other hand, is kind of the carrot. This is not to say that the church itself didn't have military power and the ability to project some kind of power, but comparatively, compared to temporal powers, they were really kind of a minor player, at least not until, or at least in this early period. Later on, when we get into the later medieval period, the church does become a formidable military power itself. But for the meantime, the church, at least in the 6th century, 7th century, and 8th century, are tied to the kingship. They need the kings to be the bad guys. So the church establishes monasteries which preserve knowledge. They win the hearts and minds through religious teachings and dogma. They set up an us versus them, almost quasi-nationalism. This kind of pan-European identity that is based upon Christian identity, not Roman identity. So they also provide a royal legitimacy by bequeathing upon the king the right to rule. Why is the king in charge? Well, the king's no longer out conquering lands. So if he's not out conquering lands, how is he the strongest leader? Well, he's the strongest leader because the church says he's the strongest leader. Well, how does the church know he's the strongest leader? Well, circularly enough, it's because he's in charge. Now, is this a watertight circle that the king is in charge because God wants him to be in charge, and so he and his offspring shall be in charge for all time? No, it is not. Of course, politics gets to rear its ugly head in this kind of relationship, but by and large, using the Franks as a model, the church and the kingship need each other. Roman Christianity, Latin Christianity, the Orthodox Nicene Christianity is very slow to penetrate the robust Germanic societies. The Germanic societies have a lot of competition. There are heretical Christian sects such as the Arians, as well as pagan religions. There's also this need for adaptation to make the foreign religion seem a little bit more attractive, a little bit more familiar. A lot of the trappings of the early Christian belief system and a lot of the symbols are based upon a Mediterranean culture. One that doesn't resonate when you get into Germania and into Western Europe and into very far Northern Europe. So there's a need to adopt Christian ideas with a pagan veneer, or a pagan holiday becomes or morphs into a kind of Christian holiday or idea. Pagans do this as well. Pagans see that Christianity is becoming successful. It is a threat to their original way of life, or it is a threat to their traditions, or it's a threat to maybe their spiritual worldview. And so they attempt to adopt some of the things that the Christians are doing in order to say, see, we're doing that too. Good example of that would be Christian symbolism. Now, there were many, many, many Christian symbols in the 5th century, 4th century. By the time we get to the 7th century and 8th century, a lot of those symbols, such as the peacock in the upper left-hand corner, that has fallen away. In its place, a crucifix comes into use. This pagan symbol, or I'm sorry, the symbol would have been familiar to pagans. Anybody who had any kind of dealings with the Romans knows that the Romans loved to nail criminals to trees, to crossbeams, to crucifixes. and so would have understood that this is a Roman-esque symbol. This is a tie to Rome. So many of the pagan symbols began to adopt crucifix-like shapes, such as the hammer of Thor that we have in the red background here, or in the center bottom with the white background, a kind of wolf crucifix, a reference to maybe some of the more pagan or more animistic gods that the Germanic tribes worshipped. And this goes back and forth. The Christians adopt their symbols that will resonate with Germans and or Germanic tribes or Germanic societies, and these Germanic pagans adopt their symbols to rival and make much more visible their loyalties. Prior to the introduction to Christianity, there's very, very little evidence that say the followers of the Norse mythology or of Germanic mythology ever wore anything to symbolize their gods. There's a lot of synchronicity that happens as Christianity adapts and adopts for each of the new regions that it infiltrates into, or that it seeps into. Christian festivals and holy days coincided initially with Jewish festivals and holy days till about the 4th century of the current era. After we get widespread acceptance within the Roman society, a lot of the Roman holidays and celebrations are co-opted or adopted by Christianity. A really good example is the 12 Days of Christmas. The 12 Days of Christmas coincide with the 12 Days of Saturnalia, the end-of-year celebration in the Roman calendar. There was this almost 2-week-long celebration. It often involved sweet cakes, the exchanging of gifts, going out and drinking and having fun with friends and singing songs and stuff like that. So it sounds very familiar to our practice of Christmas. Other holidays and traditions were drawn directly from Northern European pagan holidays. A really good example of this is All Hallows Eve, which also coincides with Samhain. In Samhain, the pagan Celtic belief of the nearness of the spirit world and the material world was emphasized. It was a time of change, a time when spirits could come back and forth between the spirit world and into the material world, and so strange things would happen. You leave out little gifts to make the spirits go away or to appease them or whatever. And of course, All Hallows Eve was actually to reinforce into Christian minds or newly Christianized minds that there are saints who are looking out for you. And so it was an honor to all the hallowed souls that had died before you. And this is, of course, just before All Saints' Day, which is the 1st of November. So it was kind of co-opted a little bit, or maybe in answer to Samhain. And of course, there were other cultural adaptations which synthesized Roman Christendom with the Germanic Christendom and paganism. Tuesday, for instance, is Thor's Day. I'm sorry, it's Tears Day. I don't know why I said Thor's Day. It's Tears Day. Wednesday is Woden's Day. Thursday is Thor's Day. There we go. Friday is Freya's Day. These are Norse gods. These are Germanic gods. The days are named after them long before Christianity comes in, and the days continue to be named that afterwards. And of course, you also have Saturn Day, Sun Day, and Moon Day. So Saturday, Sunday, and Moon Day, those come from the Roman mythology as well. So there you have it. The Merovingians, as I mentioned before, were the kings who were initially leading the Franks into what is now modern-day France in the mid-5th century. By the time we get to the 8th century, the Merovingian kings have been less able to command armies. Due to their relationship with the church, with the central church, the Latin church in Rome, the Merovingian kings had relied upon these decrees or this relationship to ensure their legitimacy. And increasingly they had withdrawn from combat and from administration, leaving the ruling of Frankish lands to their second in command, the Carolingians. It got to the point that derisively the Carolingians referred to the Merovingians as long-haired kings. Of course, having long hair is really easy for people to grab on in battle. Your helmet doesn't fit quite right. You're not ready to go out to war. So this is a very derisive thing. They're non-combatant kings, which is just a horrible insult to the early Franks. So the Carolingians become the de facto rulers of Frankish lands. In other words, without legal precedent, they do take over all of the decision-making in Frankish lands, leaving the Merovingians basically iced out. The Carolingians, particularly the mayor of the palace, occupy the majority of the military backbone of the Franks. And it isn't until about 732 of the current era that a new threat on the horizon to Christian Europe allows the throne to pass to this different family, from the Merovingians to the Carolingians. Now the Carolingians are led by Charles Martel, which is an awesome nickname. It literally means Charles the Hammer. His name in Latin was Carlos Malleus. He was the Hammer. He was the big bad warlord, commander-in-chief. And he was also the mayor of the palace. And it is at the Battle of Poitiers, which we'll get to in just a moment, that the Muslims are turned back from conquest in Europe. Now, the Muslims, which we'll get to, we will lecture about in the week after the break, they arrive in Spain around 711 of the current era and very quickly collapse the Visigothic Spanish, setting up a caliphate. There are some pockets of resistance, but by and large, the Muslims have control of the Iberian Peninsula, what is now modern-day Spain and Portugal. And they cross into the Pyrenees about 730 of the current era, and they begin conquering Gaul, or what would later become Francia. This leads to our Battle of Poitiers, or Battle of Tours, in 732. Now, the Frankish troops are led by Charles Martel, and they utilize some new military hardware for advantage in battle. One of the big advantages that the Frankish and Germanic tribes had done was to attach reinforced stirrups to their saddles, because heavy cavalry is very useful. You have a lot of weight with a very loud, brave set of warriors and horsemen who are plowing into foot soldiers. Foot soldiers basically had shields. Sometimes they had spears. Usually it was not terribly well equipped to deal with heavy cavalry. Heavy cavalry had a problem, though. Without the ability to transfer energy down their legs and into the saddle, they could very easily be knocked off the back of their horse, thus losing a lot of their advantage and a lot of their mobility. Also possibly opening up the potential for them to be killed right off the bat for falling off the horse or being slaughtered by the foot soldiers. So the stirrup, the reinforced stirrup, allowed the soldiers to dig in and transfer a lot of that energy from impact into the saddle, which then goes into the horse. So every time it changes direction, it loses a little bit of energy, and so it wasn't that big of a shock to the horse. And essentially, the upshot is that the Franks defeat the Muslim invaders and prevent any real serious attempt by Muslims to try to take Europe. For his efforts, the Pope promises that eventually the Frankish crown will pass to the Carolingians. The Merovingians' authority, as the next generation comes up, as Charles Martel's son Pippin takes the throne, the question of, or takes power as major domo. The question of legitimacy of the Merovingians is further eroded, and by the time we get to about the end of the 8th century, the Merovingians are set aside in a palace coup d'etat, relatively bloodless. They're set aside, their heads are shaved, and they're sent off to monasteries where they live the rest of their lives. And in their place, the Carolingians just kind of assume power in de jure rule, in other words, legal rule. The grandson of Charles Martel, also known as Charles the Great or Charlemagne, was the beneficiary of this long planned out, meticulously schemed kind of coup d'etat. Now, that's not to say that Charlemagne wasn't deserving of his titles. He was. He was at almost constant war with his neighbors. And for his efforts, among many things, including putting down the Lombardi, another Germanic tribe in the northern part of Italy, and saving the Pope and his armies from absolute destruction, he is named Holy Roman Emperor by the Church on Christmas Day in 800 of the current era. He becomes a protector of papal territory, but he also adopts a lot of the trappings of what he believes a Roman emperor should do, especially becoming a patron of learning, because the Romans were nothing if not educated. At Charlemagne's palace at Aachen, in Aix-la-Chapelle, he imitated a lot of the Roman practices. His palace was laid out like a Roman villa. He had Romanesque baths. They were natural, warm spring baths in the basement of his palace, which kept the water nice and warm. And of course, Charlemagne did suffer from really extensive arthritis in his later years. This is a man who lived into his 80s, and he fought every single year in the saddle, fighting in the thick of the battle. So he had a lot of injuries that he had to recuperate from. So these Romanesque baths were rumored to have healing properties. He also rebuilt Roman roads, both for the ease of movement of his troops, but also to improve trade, because he understood that conquest could only get you so far. He began to patronize monasteries in a more consistent and generous manner than any of his predecessors had before. Monasteries, again, are centers of learning and the preservation of knowledge, particularly Roman knowledge, which had largely crumbled and decayed in the centuries since the Roman collapse, and even during the Roman collapse, before the Western Roman Empire disappears. He was always trying to read. One of the stories, I don't know how apocryphal it is or how true it is, but one of the stories was that he slept with a practice tablet under his pillow, and he was always constantly practicing his Latin ABCs. So here's the Carolingian Empire, for lack of a better term, under Charlemagne, from about 770 to 814, 814 being the end of Charlemagne's really powerful reign. He expands into Catalonia, what is the Umayyad Caliphate down here in the Iberian Peninsula. He of course, as I mentioned before, he attacks the Lombardy and essentially frees Rome up and becomes a protector of Rome. He goes into Bavaria after what he deemed heretics, or actually apostates, and he also goes up into Saxony as well. The Germanic kingdoms established by Charlemagne, Charles the Great, are not truly Roman. They're Germanic emulations of the remembered, faded Roman greatness. And the near constant warfare proves that the Carolingians have the right to hold on to their territory. And also, the Franks, especially the Carolingians, spread Christianity by the sword. There's a lot of talk about spreading religions by the sword and who does what, and it's true that most religions do get spread by conquerors. Absolutely. It's a way to impose an outside order upon a subject people. A really good example of this is the massacre at Verdun. About 4,500 pagan German rebels were slaughtered for rejecting Christianity, and the reality was it was rejecting Charlemagne's rule and rebelling against Charlemagne's dominion. So what do you think is the purpose of the Pope crowning Charlemagne an emperor in 800 of the current era? Wasn't there already a Roman emperor in 800 of the current era? If your default answer is no, remember, we still have Constantinople. There's an emperor sitting there. Why would you want to have a different Roman emperor, a German Roman emperor, a Latin Roman emperor. What do you think of Charlemagne's spreading of Christianity? Does it matter so much for him to have completely Christianized his subjects? Couldn't he have left some of them pagan, or some of them Arian, or some of them, Jewish, or whatever? How does Charlemagne exemplify this idea of a warrior king? What are the downsides to becoming a warrior king? What could possibly go wrong? Let's move on to ideas of religion. Now, a lot of people ask about, did medieval Europeans really believe in Christianity? Did they believe that there were miracles possible, or that there were that their prayers were answered? Well, to many Christians in Europe in the 9th century and beyond, Christianity was as integral to identity and to their daily lives as eating and drinking are to survival. You cannot underestimate the seriousness with which medieval people took this idea of Christianity, or actually of any religion. So it became extremely difficult to sway somebody's opinion. There was this idea of obligation to the church, or obligation to the gods. There was punishment by or favor from the gods or God. And of course, there was loyalty to the doctrine of the church. Many people who were Christian, even kings, could not read at this point. And many of the policies that were shaped around this idea of what Christianity should be were from interpretations by the church. The church basically told kings, this is what the Bible says, this is the message that you should take away from it, and the kings took that ball and ran with it. So piety, it was a very real struggle in early European Christian minds between false gods and real gods. And on the flip side of the fence, the pagans saw this as a struggle between what they believed to be true gods and this false god. Now, politically, Christianity was absolutely very slow to spread through Europe. However, over time, the unity provided by that connection to the Roman Church, to the Pope in Rome, did confer a lot of benefits, and increasingly became more attractive than pagan gods. There were no real central authority in pagan gods. There was no central dogma. There was no central unifying ability. We may share a view of the way that the gods work, for example, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to work in concert. Now, the opposite was absolutely true for Christians. There were many Christian kingdoms that were able to ally with each other because of that shared Christian heritage. There was also a penetration of the Christian religion through political convenience. It was preferable to convert to Christianity and have your people convert to Christianity than to face the wrath of, for example, Charlemagne. Sometimes marriages. Often there were Christian women who were married off to pagan kings. And there's many stories in both the early Frankish periods, in the Anglo-Saxon periods, in the Nordic lands, of women who were Christian being married off to pagan husbands. And then, of course, over time, they either helped their husbands convert, or their children, who were heirs to the throne, had been raised in the Christian tradition. Also, alliances rested upon that shared cultural and religious belief as well. So many times, if you wanted to have a very strong alliance, you converted to Christianity. Whether it was genuine piety that motivated you, or politics, the reality was, once you were in the church, you didn't want to leave. Leaving the church was worse than not ever joining it in the first place. The Frankish lords, as I mentioned before, do set the bar and patronize local churches and monasteries. It leads to this neo-Romanesque kind of chapel that we see here, kind of this big, heavy thing with thin little windows, but soaring buttresses and that sort of thing. Churches are eager to accept pious donations. The system becomes a little quid quo pro, a little bit of this for that. Patrons who are off doing really bad things, like conquering people by killing them, raping, pillaging, plundering, envying their neighbors' possessions or their neighbors' prestige or whatever like that. Often paid monks who were seen as removed from the world to pray for their souls, believing that maybe the monks had a hotline to God because they were more pure. The central church, the Catholic Church, does become powerful in its own right over time. Between the 6th century, by the time we get to about the 12th or 13th century, the church has a lot of land under its belt. It has a lot of direct claim on land. It safeguards relics, it collects tithes, and most importantly, it is the go-to authority for education. A lot of these young heirs who had been raised by newly Christianized mothers or newly Christianized fathers or newly Christianized kings were sent off to the church to be educated. And of course, when you're educated by the church, you begin to see things the way that the church did. So it was a very reinforcing kind of relationship. And this is true not just for the Franks, but also for the Anglo-Saxons and eventually the Lombardy and the different Goths. And it's basically true throughout most of Europe. Now, the good thing about the monasteries is that monasteries, as I keep mentioning, they are centers of learning and preservation. Only some of the Greek and Latin learning is preserved, however. By the time we get to the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the vast majority of wealth and learning is in the eastern portion of the empire. So the Byzantines have way more in terms of books and manuscripts and things like that. Also, we have to keep in mind that many of these invading Germanic tribes, they didn't read. So to them, books were useless. Books were kindling. Scrolls were kindling. So it wasn't as bad as later historians would make it out, but this really was kind of a dark age for Europe. Some texts on philosophy, medicine, mathematics, and astronomy do survive, but not nearly as plentiful or as varied as in the eastern portion of Europe in the Byzantine Empire. The church does provide an education for well-connected individuals and provides a network of communication and diplomacy. Often the church was an intermediary in trying to broker peace between two powerful rivals, or would direct the ambitions of certain pious leaders towards certain ends, such as the elimination of heretics or the repulsion of the infidels or the purging of non-believers. Of course, there is some bad to go with this. The central church, particularly the Roman church, becomes incredibly rich. Some dioceses and monasteries become exceedingly rich in their own right, separate and independent from the central Catholic Church. They're able to field armies, they're able to levy taxes, and they control lands and become essentially nobles outside of the control, or usually outside the control of the temporal powers. Some church officials become corrupt, some become politically manipulative, and of course there are some scam artists who try to pawn off relics, bits of the crucifix of Christ, bits of bones of saints, or holy oil from the Holy Sepulchre, or things like that. And then later on, when we get back to the medieval period, we'll talk about, or the late medieval period and early Renaissance period, we'll talk about indulgences, which is basically get out of jail free cards. And these are actually happening fairly often towards the end of the medieval period. So I want you to consider the monastic life in medieval Europe. What might the downside of monasteries becoming extremely rich be? Even relatively uncorrupt monasteries had gold and jewel-encrusted objects. What might the downside of a relic be? Remember, this is a world in which superstition, religious belief, and magic are absolutely real in the mindset of everybody in Europe. In case you hadn't figured it out, well, there is a downside. Monasteries become targets of these Norse raiders. The Norse raiders, they go by a lot of different names. In the east, they're called the Rus, the men who row, and they go on to settle down the Volga River and become Russia. There are those who are called the Northmen, or Norsemen. And of course, they're called the Vikings. And Vik meaning bay or a fjord, so men of the bay. Monasteries are easy targets. They're soft. They have a relatively high ratio of gold, silver, slaves, and of course the magic of these relics to the amount of effort that's put into it. The Vikings are never really a good unified military force. They're basically farmers and sailors and fishermen, and who, during the downtime, when they're waiting for crops to grow, they go out raiding and they go get stuff. Religious differences sometimes, however, do become a cause for raids. Sometimes there's a holy war that is waged, very unofficial holy war, between pagans and Christians. A good example would be Lindisfarne on the British Isles, which is often considered the starting point of the so-called Viking Age, which lasts well into the 11th century. The Norsemen, or the Scandinavians, use technological adaptation and ingenuity to explore the world in a way that Europeans would not be able to do for several hundred years. The flexibility of their boats, for example, they had boats that were not nailed together but rather tied together, which allowed them to be flexible, so that if there was very heavy waves, that the ship flexed like a tree bending in a wind rather than get just broken apart like a twig being snapped. The low keel allowed them to move very quickly up rivers as well as in through open oceans. And the Viking Age, which is about 793 to 1066, saw the establishment of places like Dublin and Normandy, as well as Novgorod and Vinland. Vinland all the way in what is now modern-day Nova Scotia. The Vikings were able to utilize some rather ingenious technology. Remember, these guys are finding new lands in a period before magnetic compasses, sextants, star charts. They are charting unknown territory. And getting out in the open sea is very scary. It's very easy to get off course. So how did they stay on course? Well, one of the ways is they used this piece of feldspar called a sunstone. It would essentially be able to pinpoint where the sun was on cloudy days. It amplified the amount of light given off by the sun so that it was easier to spot where the sun was and know whether you were heading north or west or east or south. The Vikings had a complex web of reasons for why they did what they did. Part of it was, of course, conquest and prisoners, but it was more than that as well. Some were looking to evade oppressive taxes at home. As the raids became more successful, kings and those who stayed behind wanted to have larger shares of those raids. And also, if the raids were paying off, well, why aren't you getting more money out of the farms? And so a lot of times, tax evasion was a reason for moving. And some of them looked for new lands. The Scandinavian region can be rather harsh in the winter, and the farming can be difficult at best. Comparatively, places like Ireland and England and even France, and as far away as the Mediterranean, even the new lands in Iceland, Greenland, and Newfoundland, they were much easier to farm than Scandinavia was. And also, of course, freedom from tyranny. It's a weird thought, thinking about people who come and take slaves and ride off into the sunset with the slaves in tow and have all this loot, that they're looking to escape oppression as well. But it's true. A lot of these Norsemen do settle down in places like England and Iceland and northern part of France, because the rulers that they find themselves working for were far more generous and far more reasonable than their predecessors, than the people that they left behind. The Vikings, as I mentioned before, they settled in Ireland, Russia, North America, and France. The European advancements and stability challenge and begin to end Viking raids in favor of co-opting them. A lot of the Vikings find themselves hired on as mercenaries. They find themselves hired on as maybe parts of the regular army. Norsemen, for example, are invited to settle on the west coast of France and become a buffer state between their fellow Norse, who are raiding France and raiding Paris, and the Parisians inland. So by the end of the 11th century, all serious pagan challengers are eliminated. It should be noted, in 1066, the Vikings who were invading were Christian. Harald Hardrada himself was Christian. So a lot of these serious pagan challengers are pretty much gone. There are very small pockets of resistance here and there, but nothing serious. Feudal society allows the land to produce wealth. The wealth is used to prosecute wars as well as to enrich kingdoms. The stability affords new problems, though. You have wayward warriors and the power of kings versus nobility, as well as the influx of disease. As long as Europe stayed fractured, it was relatively insulated from one of the scourges of the ancient world, and that is the Black Death. So here's some food for thought for you. What made Christianization in Europe so slow? I want you to go back and think about the cultural and heritage boundaries and hurdles that Christianity had to overcome in order to establish itself as a European religion. Also, what does the appeal or foreignness have to play in whether this religion is accepted or it's denied? What made Christianity attractive over time? Was it stability? Was it legitimacy? Was it marriages? Could it be something else? All right, that is it. A little bit over an hour. Make sure you read Chapter 8, Continuity and Change in Europe and West Asia, and don't forget to review Chapters 1 through 8. Remember, this midterm is essentially a take-home test, so don't freak out. Whatever you do, don't freak out. Slow down. Take your time. Use sources, the sources book. Use your notes. Use your book. Do not use any other source. Please don't. Don't make me do that. That's it for this week. I hope you enjoy your break. After the midterm, we have a nice break for you. So take that time to decompress, and we will resume the week after next.